All right. Well, officially wanted to welcome everybody this evening to Capital Institute's mini workshop on regenerative economics. I know for some of you, it's really late at night. For some of you, it might be cocktail hour. For some of you, it might be morning. Please feel free to grab your beverage of choice. We're going to have fun today. My name is Alex, and I'm on the team here at Capital Institute. Capital Institute's a think tank dedicated to exploring how to bring life, a living systems approach to regenerative economics and finance. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the land of the Dakota. And for those just joining, please feel free to just drop a quick hello into the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from, maybe even what brought you here if you feel inspired. Lots of the team from Capital Institute on the call, and also the Regen Designers team. I see some familiar faces here, our course production partners. So want to give a shout out to all the team who are here, Jen, Tracy, Victoria. I can't see other faces, but feel free to give a wave if you're on the team here. Of course, John, not to overlook John. So our invitation for you today is to really join us on a journey as we explore our economy as a living system, which John's going to be guiding us through shortly. We're also going to have the chance to get a little bit of an overview of the upcoming Introduction to Regenerative Economics course. We're offering our fall cohort starting September 12th. And so we'll definitely be taking the opportunity to share a little bit more about that so that those of you who are interested can get a better feel for it. This is a 60-minute webinar. We might stay on a little longer depending on the energy in the room. We hosted another one of these last week and there was like a 45-minute discussion afterwards. So we'll see what everyone has the energy for today. We're going to just record the first part of the session and we'll leave the Q&A to just those who are in the room. So kind of just to kick us off with a grounding, I wanted to read an excerpt from a wonderful book called Journey of the Universe, which is authored by Brian Thomas Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn Tucker is one of the key thought leaders in the course and has been very inspirational to John and Capital Institute's work. I think he could speak more to that. But it's an incredible book. I would highly recommend it if you haven't had the chance to read it yet. And so I'm going to read an excerpt and have us just kind of pause and reflect on that. All right, here we go. Within an unimaginably vast and complex universe, we seek meaningful orientations in order to live an integral human life. Humans have always sought answers to questions such as, what is the nature of the universe? What is our role? By pondering such questions, we're hoping to become more fully and deeply alive in this emerging planetary era in which we find ourselves. And then I also wanted to read, there's something amazing about a universe whose overall journey depends in critical moments upon transformations taking place in the microcosm. We can begin to contemplate an idea that is remarkable. Perhaps the nature of the universe as a whole is shaped by the creativity of its parts. So we wanted to open with that. I know it might sound funny. Why are we opening with a quote about the universe when we're here to talk about economics? But the system of economics is nested within the world and the universe. And I think it's important for each of us to reflect on the role that we want to play in this economic transformation that I think we all recognize is necessary. So maybe let's take a minute to just pause and reflect and think about, I'd love for each of you to think about what is the role that you want to play in the shift towards regenerative economics. What's giving you energy about that transformation? What brought you here that got you excited about regenerative economics? So just take a moment and think about that, and then we'll dive into the program. All right, so I'll just ask you to hold that throughout this session. And yeah, I'm excited to hand it over to John, who I'm sure doesn't need a formal introduction, but John, it's been such an honor working with you over the last several years. John's really dedicated his life for the last decade to exploring how to bring a living systems approach to our economic and financial systems through his work with the Capital Institute, most notably through the 8 principles of regenerative economics. And yeah, it's been just so such a pleasure working together, John, and I'm excited to hand it over to you to guide us on this next part of today. You are on mute. Oh, John, you're muted.
How's that?
Better.
I'll start over. Alex, the feelings are mutual for sure. Thank you for setting the tone here. And thanks everyone for taking some time out this evening or whatever time it is where you are. It's really an honor to have people show up for these things. And it's particularly intriguing to me to see some familiar faces. Some people that were in the course are still here, and there's something I think about this regenerative movement that once you see it, you sort of can't unsee it. And so maybe this is a warning to all of you. You may be about to get addicted to something you may not be realizing, but certainly has been the case for me. And the quote that Alex read, particularly the second part of it, this idea that, when we feel so helpless in the face of everything that's happening, it's pretty interesting to contemplate this idea that as quantum physics teaches us, everything is connected to everything. And whether our actions and even our intentions and emotions and consciousness affects obviously our own self and our own health, our own families, our own communities, but also our own bioregions, the companies we work in, the institutions we work in, the nations we live in, and the whole world. And shockingly, stunningly, in this little book, Journey to the Universe, the 8 principles that I'll describe show up all throughout that book, meaning living systems, patterns, and principles extend beyond the Earth and to the entire universe. It's pretty exciting, and it's very empowering, I think, to believe that yes, our actions and our decisions and our intentions can actually and will actually help influence the future that we are contemplating now. So I'm going to kind of fly through some slides. This is a bit of a selection from the course that we're going to introduce as well. This is meant to give you a taste and not fulfill you and make you go away. It's meant to make you come back and hopefully want some more. So I kind of apologize in advance that it's going to be a lot thrown at you very quickly. I'm sure it'll stimulate some good discussion and hopefully help you think about this challenge that we all face in through a new lens. I need to share my screen. Oops, did something wrong already, sorry. I think I'd be better at this by now.
No rush.
No rush, he says. I flipped to, there we go. Now, just need to find my, what is that there? I had my PowerPoint all ready to go and now it disappeared. There it is. How's that?
There you go.
I'm in good shape? Okay. So again, this is just a little mini workshop, and it's not moving. There we go. I think the image here probably feels familiar to all of us. I don't need to go into the dissertation on all of the challenges we face that are geopolitical, social, economic, ecological, all sort of interconnected, health, and seemingly things are spinning out of control. And I know this is very disconcerting to all of us. I certainly feel it myself. I'd be lying if I if I didn't say it's affected me deeply and personally. And as someone who's been sort of following this for over a decade, really 2 decades since I left Wall Street, it sort of feels like a slow-moving train wreck, and but a predictable one that seems like we're struggling to get in front of. Thomas Berry is one of my big influencers, teachers. I wish I had met him before he passed away. But this, his description about the old story no longer working, and we haven't yet learned a new story, seems very apt for our global economy. He was describing that in a more theological sense, but it certainly is true about the narrative or the paradigm that we believe in. It doesn't work anymore. We could debate how well it worked in the past, but it clearly doesn't work now. And the incremental changes that we're trying to make are proving to be inadequate, and yet we don't have a new story. And I hope that the regenerative paradigm and regenerative economics is the foundation of a new story that we can construct together. But just as a quick review, the old story of economics that we live within is this idea that economic growth is the source of our future prosperity. And that's been true pretty much since the Industrial Revolution. And whether you're a socialist or a communist or a capitalist, economic growth is the shared mantra for our path to prosperity. And our businesses, our companies, our governments, tax bases are all linked to economic growth. And so it's become associated with progress, and yet we don't ever question it. Even though the person that invented the GNP indicators and won a Nobel Prize for that warned us that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from the measure of national income. Now, there's a whole industry around alternatives to GDP, but Kenneth Boulding said it best long before this industry arose, which in very simple terms, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And I believe Boulding said that probably in the 1970s, could even have been the late 1960s. So the proposition that I'm suggesting is that the entire theoretical foundation of modern economics, what's called neoclassical economics, which dates back to the scientific revolution, is fatally flawed. And in the course we go in, I explain why I believe that's true, why it's actually self-evident. But there's another reality that I've become increasingly focused on. And interestingly, I moved during the pandemic to a little town in Eastern Connecticut called Stonington. And Stonington is where the Pequot tribe, or Stonington is what used to be Pequot Nation. And in Mystic, which is right on the edge of Stonington, there was the first genocide in North America occurred in 1637, right around the same time that the scientific revolution was taking off. And beyond the moral atrocity of that, what it really set in motion was the reality that indigenous wisdom, at least in North America, would be ignored by the settlers and by the new country when it was formed later. And the combination of destroying indigenous wisdom and falling in love with our reductionist scientific method that of course brought great progress with the scientific revolution, but also great limitations, is the root of this fatal flaw in economics. And Irving Fisher was one of the great early neoclassical economists. And again, this is a very quick summary of what we talk about in some more detail in the beginning of the course. But I couldn't read his work. It's mostly math. But I did validate something I had learned, which is that neoclassical economics is literally grounded in Newtonian physics. And of course, Newton was the star at the beginning of the scientific revolution. And so there was a lot of Newton envy. And there was a group of political philosophers earlier than Irving Fisher who set up this idea that there was a parallel set of laws for the natural economy that mirrored the Newtonian laws of mechanics, Newtonian physics. And you see here a page from Fisher's textbook that shows that a particle in mechanics corresponds to the individual, as if an individual is simply a particle. And more stunning to me, that the laws of energy somehow equated to the utility function in economics. Now, I've read that the physicists at the time said to these early economists that they were crazy, and this made no sense and was not grounded in any valid logic. But there was a strong desire to turn economics into a science and put a layer of mathematics on it to make it seem, comparable to physics. And so thus we have neoclassical economics. Even Keynes was trained by a neoclassical economist. And you could view Keynesian economics as a patch to some of the flaws of neoclassical economics. And many of the other developments in economics as well, I argue in the course, are also really patches to this original flawed theory. And then, as if it needed any more proof, the Nobel Prize in Economics, which by the way isn't a legitimate Nobel Prize, it's actually the Swedish Central Bank Prize in honor of Nobel, to try to give again some legitimacy to the field, I would suggest, literally awarded the Nobel Prize, or the prize in honor of Nobel, in 2018 to William Nordhaus for his model that proposed that 3.5 degrees was the optimum warming we should shoot for, because anything lower would cost too much. And this at a time, well past the time that the scientific consensus among the climate scientists was that we needed to keep below 1.5 degrees warming. And you all know the difference between 1.5 and 3.5 degrees warming. This is literally incomprehensible to me that this happened, but it did happen. So I suggest that our economic theory is grounded on a false assumption. It wasn't even updated when we developed quantum physics, but the idea that it's grounded in Newtonian physics rather than in living systems is, to me, self-evident, and a self-evident mistake, and the consequences are profound. Of course, our economic theoretical foundation has also led to grotesque inequality and extreme financial instability, which has led to political instability. I mean, we don't need to go through the litany of problems. Climate change, of course, is only one of 9 planetary boundaries. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work of the Stockholm Resiliency Institute. Climate change there in the top in the middle shows that we've moved outside the green zone, the safe zone, into the yellow zone. But the ones that are in the orange zone are even more problematic. Biosphere integrity is another word for biodiversity. And if you want to get yourself depressed, go to a biodiversity conference and learn about the 6th great extinction. So even if we invented free, clean energy and implemented it around the world tomorrow for everybody, we would be, in fact, I would argue we would accelerate our race over the cliff, because climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom to a flawed economic system. Now, going back to the scientific revolution and our scientific method, the premise, the foundational idea of regenerative economics is that we need to learn to see the world through new eyes. We need to learn to see the world holistically and not rely on the reductionist method that gave us so much advances in our science, but also leaves us blind to how everything is connected to everything. And I love quoting Wes Jackson on this: there's nothing wrong with the reductionist method, so long as we don't confuse the method with how the world actually works. Now, when we move into the world of holistic thinking and holistic understanding, it's because we live in a world of complexity. And what the reductionist method is really good at is solving problems that are complicated, like how do we put a man on the moon, or how do we fly in space, or how does Zoom work on these computers so we can all have this conversation. Complicated things can be reduced to best solutions. Problems get solved. Complexity, on the other hand, is not something that you can solve. It's something you need to work with. And so, for example, the United Nations is complex. A nation state is complex. A family is complex. And I would argue the global economy is complex. The financial system is complex. And we as human beings aren't very good yet at working with and managing with complexity. And that is really at the heart of our challenge. Living systems are complex systems. So we're trying to manage a global economy that I argue is a living system using reductionist Newtonian logic in economics. And of course, it's not working very well. Now, one thing we know about complexity from complexity science and complex systems is that they don't change incrementally. They change, it's kind of like the way a company goes bankrupt. At first slowly and then quickly. And that's called a phase shift transition. Another example is if you put a pot of water on the stove and turn up the heat, eventually it moves from a liquid state to a gaseous state. And that happens very quickly. And these phase shift transitions describe how living systems, how complex systems change. And so and yet economics is grounded on an idea of incremental change, marginal utility of this, marginal price impact on that. It's not designed to deal with complexity to begin with. And so what I think we're facing and the time we happen to be living, and really it maps to, in round numbers, the beginning of this century, is the end of the modern era and the beginning of some new era that hasn't yet been named. And I'll call it the regenerative era, for lack of a better term. I think it's a great term. But imagine that we actually live in a moment of time that's comparable to the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, the time of the beginning of the scientific revolution, the time that Copernicus discovered or pointed out, saw through new lens that no, it wasn't that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around the Earth. It's that the Earth is revolving around the sun and all the planets are revolving around the sun. That fundamentally changes how we see ourselves in the world. And of course, that was very threatening to the power base at the time, which was largely the Catholic Church in the West, just as this notion that the scientific method, the reductionist approach, our analytical minds, reducing problems to small pieces that we can solve, can no longer address the problems of complexity. That's also very destabilizing to those in positions of power, certainly to the Nobel Committee that awards the economic prize. And so we live at this amazing moment, which is really at the time of a change in era. And none of us knows what that really means. But what I believe it certainly requires is that we develop a more accurate theory of how to organize and design and manage our economy. And as Einstein says, theory is what determines what we're able to see. Theory, theos is the search for truth. And we know objectively that the understanding of how the world works in Newtonian physics is not our greatest and our most developed understanding of how the world works. Living systems science builds on Newtonian physics, builds on quantum physics, but adds the complexity of life to it. And so it would seem to me that we need an economics that's grounded in an understanding of how living systems work. So a quick definition, regenerative economics is the application of nature's laws and patterns of systemic health, self-organization, self-renewal, and regenerative vitality to the design of socioeconomic systems. And it's important that I say socioeconomic systems because one of the simplifying reductionist separations that occurred in economics is to separate economics from political science and political philosophy, because it made the math work easier. It wasn't as messy. But these two things are inextricably linked, as we all intuitively understand. And so a theory of economics will need to be a theory of socioeconomic well-being, not just economics on its own. Now, a couple words about what what regenerative economics is not. It is not simply a new name for sustainability. It is not a political philosophy of the left or the right. My hope is that in the future, the left and the right will be arguing about how to foster a regenerative economy, just as the political left and right today argue about how to foster a growing economy. And third, regenerative economics is not simply an agricultural idea or an environmental idea alone. But of course, regenerative economics has its roots in regenerative agriculture. As one would expect, an economy needs to be built on a regenerative economy needs to be built on a regenerative agricultural system. Without a healthy agriculture system, there is no hope for a regenerative society. So a couple premises about regenerative economics that are important to consider and potentially reject. The most important one being the human economy is a living system. Today, it's an unhealthy living system. Some might argue it's on the brink of becoming a dead system. But the premise here is that the human economy is made up of humans. Humans are clearly living systems. And that Gaia theory, increasingly accepted, suggests that the planet itself, the biosphere, the outer ring, the small, thin edge of our planet is a living system. And so if in accordance with the laws or the patterns of the fractal patterns of how living systems work, if Gaia is a living system and humans are a living system, then the human economy, which is embedded in Gaia and made up of humans, itself needs to behave like a living system if it's going to be sustainable like other living systems. Premise number two is that there are actually patterns and principles that describe how all living systems that have sustained themselves in the real world work. I've studied these in some detail. I'm no expert at this, but there are scholars who will agree with this general assertion. They're not as simple as laws, like the laws of physics. They're patterns and they're first principles. And when I say principle, I don't mean ethics. I mean kind of a first principle or a quality that shows up consistently as a descriptor of how life works. The third premise is that, as I mentioned before, if the human economy is going to be sustainable and thrive in the long run, it will need to be designed in accordance with these same patterns and principles. Now, in my work, I've developed, everyone's got, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I have one core contribution to make to the field of regenerative economics that isn't even really a field yet. It's this mandala of what I consider to be the 8 core first principles of a regenerative economy. And this again is from the study of living system science and my understanding of economies. If I were to describe the core first principles of a regenerative healthcare system or regenerative agriculture or a regenerative real estate industry, I might come up with, and you all might come up with, different principles that would rise to the top. These are not by any means, these aren't intended to imply truth. They're intended to be a guide or a compass to help us navigate directionally toward a regenerative system. I go into a lot of detail. We spend 2 weeks on this in the course, but maybe I'll just read these quickly. In right relationship, this idea of mutualism, symbiotic relationship, empowered participation. This is different than simply being inclusive, which is now a popular term in the new economy space. Empowered participation means that the health of the whole system is dependent on the participation of all the parts of the system. It's not just an ethical or a moral requirement, it's actually a systemic health requirement. And the example I always use is our feet and our toes need to participate in the circulation of oxygen, which is not just good for our toes, it's actually essential for our whole systemic health. Views wealth holistically. This is, simply stated, money does not equal wealth. This is where the whole multiple capitals framework fits nicely in. Innovative, adaptive, and responsive. That sort of speaks for itself, but it also says something about our entrepreneurial economy in contrast with massive corporations or massive state enterprises that have much more difficult time innovating and adapting and responding to change. Balance is not a static balance, it's a harmonic balance. Think of more of a dynamic unicycle rider than a set of scales that are static. But balance of many, many different things we discuss in the course, beginning with the balance of masculine and feminine energy, which of course our current culture lacks. Edge effect is in living systems, they're called ecotones. It's where two different systems meet. It's where diversity is abundant and where innovation tends to happen. And so if we silo ourselves into our expertise, we dampen the edge effects of healthy living systems. So it suggests we need transdisciplinary thinking, transdisciplinary approaches to our problem solving, something that we're not accustomed to doing either in the academy or frankly in the business world or in government sectors that are isolated into different sectors of responsibility. Living systems exist in place. And so for human economies, human culture is where human culture and geologic reality intersect creates the context for a healthy human economy. So while these principles apply, I would suggest universally, they will be contextualized for each specific place and each community. So every snowflake looks like a snowflake, but every snowflake is also unique. And finally, robust circulation. An economy is a metabolism. This is where circular economy fits, but this is not just for matter, or materials and energy. It's importantly for information and empathy and intention. And it also demands healthy inputs and healthy outputs. So this is where, climate change is in conflict, or emissions, excess emissions is in conflict with this first principle. So by definition, we have an unstable and degenerative system if we don't have robust circulation that allows us healthy inputs. So austerity is in conflict with this, but also healthy outputs of waste that need to be absorbed into the environment in a healthy way, which obviously is not a condition that exists today. So there's a lot to unpack in that. This is really just meant to be a teaser and really an introduction to this course that we're putting on. This fall, we begin the second cohort of a course on the introduction to regenerative economics. And this is actually a photograph of a painting I have in my office here, which I sort of stumbled upon and it spoke to me, but it really describes how I felt after I left the comfort of Wall Street and wandered in the wilderness for a while. It was like I got in a boat and shoved off from the beach and rode out into the fog. And I've been on this search ever since. And the course in many ways is an invitation to join me on a quick summary of the journey and the search I've been on, and learn with me what I've discovered along the way. The course is structured with three core elements. There's kind of classic lectures that happen once a week live. There's also on a second day during the week what we call a discovery dialogue, and we get into discussion about how important dialogue is as opposed to debate and even discourse. So there's the dialogues are with another thought leader and myself, teeing up a conversation that we have with the whole learning community. Second, there are practice labs. This is where we try to show applied cases, concretize these theoretical conceptual ideas and show living examples related to the topic of that week. And then there's this brilliant community-based learning that happens. And I said at the beginning of the last course, and I now believe it's truer than I realized, the community really is the curriculum. And there's all kinds of collaboration that has sprung up in response to the course, which makes my heart go pitter-patter. But this is really about all of us coming together, realizing we're not alone, realizing we need to learn and grow in community together, and learning to learn together. And I would dare to imagine there'll be businesses formed out of this community and lifelong friendships born out of this community. Finally, it's not just me. We have really a all-star cast of really thoughtful people that bring their own perspectives. What they share in common is, whether they use the language or not, many do, but not all of them, a shared idea that that we need to move toward a living systems framework to think about how to organize society and the economy in particular. All this information, of course, is on our website. The the curriculum, we start with an introduction, and I go into this definition of the fatal flaw of neoclassical economics in much more detail than I did tonight. We spend 2 weeks on this idea of shifting from reductionism to holism, and a discussion of the 8 principles. Then we move to in a sense microeconomics, how to apply this to the firm, and firms living in a world of complexity, not a world that's complicated. Then we have a conversation 1 week about macroeconomics, even meta-economics. This is a massive topic that needs its own course, but we at least introduce some concepts on how this regenerative paradigm applies to fiscal policy, monetary policy, money itself, and the need for new institutions, and how some institutions are not fit for purpose in this postmodern age. A week on finance. Again, we'll have another course on finance at some point in the future, but finance is obviously the elephant in the room to a lot of this. So we spend a week talking about how to apply living systems principles to our current financial system and what that might hold. We spend a week on leadership. Regenerative leadership is now a growing space within the regenerative paradigm, and we have some brilliant people joining us to lead us in that. And then we bring it all together with a reconnection with the timeless wisdom, indigenous wisdom, Eastern, Western wisdom, using, in particular, Mary Evelyn Tucker joins us in the dialogue that week, and hopefully kind of grounds this all in the enormity of the moment that we live and the importance that is beyond simple economics. And I think if you ask people that went through the trial run last spring, you'll get a lot of positive feedback. The one I love and want to showcase here tonight is from Ted Manning, who was a senior executive at Patagonia. Patagonia, obviously not new to the sustainability challenge, and Ted said in an email, it meaning the course, blew our doors off. I will never see the world or my role in it the same way again. And that's really my hope for all of us, is that this experience becomes kind of a, there was my life before I saw it this way, and now once I see the world this way, it makes sense, and I can never go back to seeing things the way I did before. And that will drive change. And it's not for me or for any of us to figure out how this applies to everything. But if people have this shared view, I think it will change the way they bring out their agency in their lives and their impact in their work. And going back to Alex's initial quote, we'll begin to see that our collective intentions and actions do actually shift at least how the global economy works, if not the entire universe. I'll close on Bucky Fuller. Buckminster Fuller, in his final book that was published the year he died, I think it was 1983, wrote a critique of capitalism. The book is called Grunch. Most Bucky Fuller fans probably never heard of it. And he closes the book by telling us, warning us that nature is a totally efficient, self-regenerating system. If we discover the laws that govern this system and live synergistically within them, sustainability will follow and humankind will be a success. And what's not written, but clearly implied, if you read the book, you would agree with me, is that if we don't do this, we're in deep trouble. And you can imagine when I discovered this quote, after I had developed my own thinking, it was sort of like, there's no new idea under the sun, but it gave me great confidence that this is going to be my life work. And I hope to bring some of you along on this journey with me.